The grand ballroom shimmered with 1,000 points of light, each crystal of the chandelier reflecting a facet of a life Alara had come to despise. She stood at the top of the marble staircase, a vision in silk and diamonds, the undisputed center of a universe that orbited her family's fortune. Below her, a sea of tailored suits and glittering gowns ebbed and flowed, every smile a calculated gesture, every laugh a carefully measured social currency. She was the prize, the ultimate trophy, and every suitor in the room was a hunter in polished shoes. For years, she had played her part, the gracious and beautiful heiress, accepting the hollow compliments and the empty flattery. She had even allowed herself to believe in one of them. Adrian Vance, with his easy charm and seemingly genuine affection, had felt different. He had spoken of art and philosophy, of dreams that existed outside bank statements, and for a fleeting, beautiful moment, she had imagined a life built on something more substantial than gold. Needing a moment's respite from the suffocating performance, she slipped through a side door into the relative quiet of the colonnaded hallway, the muffled sounds of the quartet a distant hum. The cool stone was a relief against her palms. It was then that she heard them, Adrian's smooth, confident baritone and the gruff, familiar voice of his business partner, Mr. Thorne. She pressed herself against the wall, hidden by the deep shadow of an alcove, her breath catching in her throat. "Patience, Charles," Adrian was saying, a hint of indulgent laughter in his tone. "The wedding is in a month. Once the ring is on her finger and the papers are signed, her entire trust fund becomes accessible. A few more weeks of playing the lovesick fool is a small price to pay to save my company. The girl is practically a simpleton, wrapped in a very expensive package. She'll never see it coming." The words were not merely lies. They were demolition, collapsing the fragile future she had built in her mind. The cold seeped from the marble through her gown and into her very bones. The charming smiles, the whispered endearments, the future he painted, all of it was a meticulously crafted lie. She was not a woman to be loved. She was a balance sheet to be acquired. A strange, icy calm settled over her. The tears that threatened did not fall. Instead, a sharp, crystalline plan began to form in the wreckage of her naivety. He saw her as a simpleton, a prize to be won, then a simpleton she would become. He valued her fortune above her character. Then he would be introduced to her character stripped of its fortune. Pushing away from the wall, she walked back toward the ballroom, her steps measured and sure. Her eyes found Adrian across the crowd, laughing charmingly at something an elderly dowager had said. He was the perfect actor on his stage. A grim smile touched her lips. It was time to write a new scene, one in which he would become the unwitting player in her game. She would disappear, and in her place, a new maid would arrive for her first day of work. She would watch him, study him, and uncover every rotten truth behind his polished facade. The hunt was over. The test was about to begin. The service entrance to the Whitlock mansion was a world away from the grand gilded front doors Alara had always used. Tucked down a narrow cobbled lane, it was a mouth of grim utilitarian stone, smelling of damp earth and strong lye soap. Standing before it, Alara felt a profound sense of dislocation. The simple, rough-spun maid's dress she wore itched terribly against her skin, a coarse and constant reminder of the persona she had to embody. Ellie. The name felt small and foreign in her mind, a shrunken version of herself. Taking a steadying breath that did little to calm the frantic drumming of her heart, she lifted a hand and rapped on the heavy oak door. The sound was swallowed by the thick wood, a meek announcement compared to the confident chime of the main doorbell. Moments later, the door swung inward to reveal a woman who could have been carved from granite. Mrs. Higgins, the head housekeeper, was a tall, severe figure draped in unadorned black, her silver hair pulled into a knot so tight it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. Her eyes, a flinty gray, scanned Alara from head to toe in one swift, dismissive motion. Without a word of greeting, the woman turned and strode back into the dim interior, leaving Alara to hurry after her into a stark, stone-floored hallway. The air was heavy with the smell of starch and simmering stew. This was the engine room of the house, all function and no beauty. a stark contrast to the polished world above. Mrs. Higgins led her to a scullery, where a mountain of fine china sat waiting in a tub of cloudy, greasy water. The head housekeeper pointed a bony finger at the sink. Her instructions were a clipped monotone list of demands. Water temperature, the specific brand of soap to be lathered onto a soft cloth, the exact number of rinses required, the meticulous way each plate was to be dried and inspected for streaks. Ilara's hands, accustomed to the weight of nothing heavier than a champagne flute, plunged into the hot, sudsy water. Almost immediately, she fumbled a delicate salad plate. It slipped from her soapy fingers, chiming loudly against the porcelain sink before she caught it, her heart leaping into her throat. Mrs. Higgins's stare was a physical weight, cold and disapproving. The work was agonizing. Her soft, unblemished palms burned from the hot water and harsh soap. The muscles in her shoulders, used to the gentle sway of a dance, screamed in protest at the constant, repetitive motion. Each piece of china felt like a lead weight, her clumsy, untrained movements a betrayal of her body's usual grace. She was painfully slow, her progress a source of obvious contempt for the statuesque woman who watched her every move, offering only sharp corrections and sighs of profound disappointment. This was her first test, and Ilara, the heiress, was failing spectacularly at being Ellie, the maid. The luxurious prison of her life had simply traded golden bars for ones of soap and steam. The next task was dusting the grand library, a room Ilara had always loved for its quiet majesty and scent of old paper and leather. Now, holding a feather duster that felt alien and foolish in her hand, the space felt intimidating. Each first edition book, each priceless artifact on its shelf, was a trap waiting to be sprung by her unskilled touch. She moved with painstaking slowness, her aching arms protesting every lift, her focus entirely on not causing a catastrophic, expensive accident. She was perched precariously on the top rung of a library ladder, gingerly dusting the ornate frame of a massive portrait of her own grandfather, when the door clicked open. Her breath hitched. She knew that footfall, that subtle shift in the air that announced his presence. Adrian. He strode into the room, humming softly to himself, a man utterly at home in his domain. He went straight to the mahogany desk, rifling through a stack of correspondence, his back to her. Ilara froze, a statue on a ladder, desperately hoping to blend into the woodwork. The seconds stretched, each one a small eternity filled with the rustle of paper and the frantic beating of her own heart. Then he turned, and his eyes, those warm, laughing eyes she had fallen for, swept across the room and landed on her. There was no recognition, only a flicker of mild annoyance at the presence of a servant in his space. His expression cooled, the charming ease evaporating into something distant and impersonal. He snapped his fingers sharply, the sound cracking through the silent room like a whip. "You, Maid, move. You're in my light." The command was so cold, so utterly devoid of the courtesy he showed even the most minor social acquaintance, that it stole the air from her lungs. This was the man who had, just last night, held her hands and whispered how her presence brightened his whole world. Now her presence was an inconvenience, a piece of furniture to be ordered about. Flustered, she scrambled down the ladder, her foot slipping on the last rung. She stumbled, catching herself hard on the rail, the jolt sending a fresh wave of pain through her sore shoulders. A soft, involuntary gasp escaped her. Adrian didn't move to help. He didn't ask if she was all right. He simply watched her struggle with a look of detached impatience, as one might watch a clumsy animal. "Careful," he said, his tone flat and devoid of any real concern. "The furnishings in this room are worth more than you'll make in a lifetime. Try not to break anything on your way out." He turned back to his papers, dismissing her completely. The humiliation was a hot flush that crept up her neck and burned her cheeks. She gathered her cleaning supplies with trembling hands and hurried from the library, his indifference a colder shock than any of Mrs. Higgins's sharp words. The charming suitor was gone, replaced by this cold, imperious stranger. And with that chilling transformation, Ilara's initial suspicion hardened into a cold, certain dread. This was not just a man capable of deception. This was a man who looked at those he deemed beneath him and saw nothing at all. That evening, The grand house settled into a hushed rhythm, the echoes of the day's labor fading into the whisper of settling beams and the soft tread of servants finishing their duties. Ilara, her body a symphony of aches, was assigned to polish the silver in the small servants' parlor adjacent to the main drawing room. The door between the rooms was slightly ajar, a sliver of golden light, and the low murmur of a voice spilling through. It was Adrian's voice. The cold, dismissive tone he had used with her that afternoon was gone, replaced by the warm, mellifluous baritone she knew so well. Her hands stilled on a heavy candelabra, every nerve ending suddenly alert. She found herself shifting silently on her stool, edging closer to the crack in the door, drawn by the horrific fascination of his performance. He was on the telephone, his posture relaxed in a deep leather armchair, one leg crossed over the other. A crystal glass of amber liquid sat on a side table, catching the firelight. His face, which had been a mask of bored impatience hours before, was now arranged into an expression of tender concern. He was the picture of a devoted, worried fiancé. "My darling, I hate the thought of you being unwell and so far away," he was saying, his voice dripping with a sincerity that made her stomach clench. "The house feels so empty without you. Every room echoes. I was in the library today, and I could almost see you curled in your favorite chair, your nose in some dreadful romantic novel." Ilara's fingers tightened around the polishing cloth. That very chair was where she had been reading just last week, and he had teased her for her choice of literature before kissing the top of her head. Now he used the memory as a prop, a carefully chosen detail to sell his lie. "Don't you worry about a thing," he continued, his tone softening further into an intimate caress. "Just focus on getting your rest. Your health is all that matters to me. The wedding can wait, my love. I would wait an eternity for you." He listened for a moment, a gentle, loving smile playing on his lips, a smile that had never once been directed at Ellie, the maid. The contrast was so violent it was dizzying. This man, spinning a web of tender falsehoods for the absent Ilara, was the same man who had snapped his fingers at her, who had looked at her as if she were an insect to be brushed aside. "I miss you terribly," he murmured into the receiver, his voice a low, heartfelt thrum that had once made her believe in fairy tales. "Sleep well, my dearest. Dream of me." He replaced the receiver with a soft click. The loving concern evaporated from his face instantly, like a mask removed. He picked up his glass, took a slow sip, and stared into the fire, his expression now one of cool, calculating satisfaction. The performance was over. The audience, hundreds of miles away, had been perfectly convinced. In the dark of the servants' parlor, Ilara sat frozen, the weight of his duplicity pressing down on her. The polished silver in her hands felt cold and dead. The charming facade was flawless, a masterpiece of deception, and she was now the only one who could see the rotten emptiness behind it. The following morning, Ilara's body protested every movement with a chorus of aches, a physical testament to her new reality. Mrs. Higgins, with her hawk-like scrutiny, assigned her the one room Ilara had both dreaded and longed to see, Adrian Cherris' private study. It was a space she had seldom entered as herself, a masculine sanctum of dark wood and leather that had always felt more like a corporate office than a part of their shared home. Now, as Ellie, she crossed the threshold with a bucket and rags, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The room smelled of him, of expensive cologne, fine cigar smoke, and the faint, sharp scent of ambition. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air like tiny conspirators. Her instructions were precise. Every surface was to be wiped, every book straightened, every trace of disorder eliminated. She worked slowly, her eyes scanning not for dirt, but for secrets. Each drawer she cautiously wiped along the top of, each paper she gently nudged aside with her cloth felt like a potential betrayal. But the desk, the bookshelves, the handsome globe bar, all yielded nothing but the mundane debris of a businessman's life. It was as she was emptying the small brass wastebasket beside the desk that her breath caught. Amongst crumpled drafts of letters and discarded memos, A small slip of thick, cream-colored paper felt different beneath her fingers. It was a receipt, crisply printed but now crushed into a tight ball. Her pulse quickened as she carefully smoothed it open on her apron. The header was from a jeweler called La Reverie, a name that meant nothing to her despite her extensive knowledge of the city's luxury retailers. The date was from just 3 days prior. The item purchased was listed simply as a platinum and diamond pendant, and the price listed below made her own considerable jewelry collection seem almost modest. But it was the final line that turned the blood in her veins to ice. In the space reserved for the client's name, typed in clean, impersonal font, was a name that was not her own. Isadora Vance. The paper trembled in her hand. Isadora. She knew that name. It was his mother's name, a woman who had passed away years ago. A gift for a memory, but the date was recent. The purchase exorbitant and the store unknown. A cold dread, sharper than any she had felt before, began to coil in her stomach. This was not a gift for a ghost. This was a gift for someone real, someone who warranted a secret of such value. With a furtive glance at the door, her ears straining for any sound of approaching footsteps, she folded the receipt into a tiny, tight square. Her fingers, still raw from scrubbing, slipped it into the hidden pocket she had sewn into the rough fabric of her dress. The paper felt like a brand against her skin, a tiny, damning piece of evidence in a case she was building against the man she was supposed to marry. The opulent room seemed to close in around her, every gleaming surface now a mirror reflecting her growing anxiety, and the terrifying truth that Adrian E.'s lies ran far deeper than she had ever imagined. The cavernous laundry room in the mansion's basement was a world of steam and rhythmic noise, a humid purgatory where secrets could easily be lost beneath the churning of the industrial washers. Ilara was sorting a mountain of linen, her movements still awkward and slow, her mind awhirl with the image of the jeweler's receipt burning a hole in her pocket. The name, Isadora Vance, echoed in her thoughts. A ghost with a brand new, devastatingly expensive diamond pendant. 2 senior maids, Beatrice and Clara, worked with an efficient, synchronized rhythm at the long ironing boards nearby, their practiced hands moving with a confidence Ilara could only envy. They were deep in conversation, their voices a low hum beneath the mechanical groans of the appliances. At first their words were just another part of the room's cacophony. Then a name sliced through the steam, sharp and clear. "Seen him again last night, I'm sure of it," Beatrice was saying, her voice hushed with the thrill of the illicit. "Slipped out through the garden gate near midnight. The car wasn't his usual one either. Something smaller, less noticeable." Ilara's hands stilled on a pillowcase. She kept her head bowed, her posture one of utter absorption in her menial task, but every sense was now laser-focused on the 2 women. She picked up another item to fold, her movements deliberately sluggish to buy more time to listen. "It's always the same," Clara replied, her tone a mixture of gossip and disapproval. "Twice this week alone. Mrs. Higgins covers for him, tells anyone who asks that he's working late at the office. But we know better, don't we?" "The client," Beatrice said, investing the word with a wealth of sarcastic implication. "That's what his driver calls her when he thinks no one's listening. Always a late meeting with the client." A cold knot tightened in Ilara's stomach. The client. The words from the receipt, La Reverie on the pendant, the name Isabella, suddenly found a terrifying new context. This was no gift for a family memorial. This was payment for services rendered, a token for a secret liaison. She forced herself to take a slow, steady breath, afraid the sound of her pounding heart would give her away. She kept her eyes fixed on the seemingly endless pile of sheets, her fingers mechanically smoothing non-existent wrinkles, her entire being a monument to pretended ignorance. The hum of the iron and the churn of the washing machine seemed to grow louder, a dissonant symphony underscoring the whispered conspiracy. Clara leaned closer to Beatrice, her voice dropping even further, a thread of genuine intrigue weaving through her words. "My cousin works for the Darringtons," she murmured, the name landing like a stone in the steamy air. The Darringtons. Ilara's blood ran cold. They were the old money rivals to her own family's empire, a constant thorn in their corporate side, known for their cutthroat business tactics and bitter generations-long feud with the Whitlocks. She says she saw Mr. Vance at some private club last week, deep in conversation with a woman from their legal team. All very hushed, very serious, not exactly a social call. Beatrice let out a low, knowing whistle. A Darrington lawyer is his client? That doesn't sound like business. That sounds like treason. The word hung between them heavy and damning. Or a merger of a different sort. The implication was a physical blow. Ilara's mind, already reeling, now raced at a breakneck pace, connecting the jagged pieces with a horrifying clarity. The late-night outings, the secretive client, the rival company. It crashed into the receipt burning against her thigh. The extravagant hidden gift for a woman named Isadora. Isadora wasn't a ghost. She was a weapon. The jewelry wasn't a romantic token. It was a bribe, a payoff, a seal on some treacherous pact. The sterile, ordered world of the laundry room tilted on its axis. The neatly folded linens in her arms were no longer just laundry. They were the trappings of a life that was being systematically dismantled behind her back. Adrian wasn't just a faithless fiancé. He was a corporate saboteur, conspiring with the enemy. And his courtship, his impending marriage to her, the simpleton wrapped in an expensive package, was the key to it all. He needed access to her fortune, her name, her legacy, not to build a life with her, but to hand it all over to the wolves. She forced her trembling hands to place another perfectly folded sheet onto the growing pile, her face a careful mask of vacant concentration. But inside, a storm of betrayal and fury was breaking. Each whispered word from the maids another crack in the foundation of the future she had almost believed in. The game was no longer just about testing his loyalty. It was about uncovering a plot that threatened to destroy everything she was. The mansion, usually a symphony of whispered activity, had fallen into a profound and watchful silence. The grand clock in the hall had chimed two, its somber notes echoing through the dark, empty corridors like a funeral bell. Ilara lay rigid in her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, the coarse sheets scratching against her skin, but it was not physical discomfort that kept her awake. It was the gnawing, relentless suspicion, fed by the whispered secrets of the maids and the cold, damning evidence of the receipt in her pocket. The image of Adrian slipping out into the night to meet his client played over and over behind her eyelids. The study, his inner sanctum, held the answers. Moving with a silence born of desperate purpose, she slipped from the bed. The floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet. She did not light a lamp. The faint silver glow of the moon through the high, small window was her only guide. Dressed in her dark maid's dress, she was a shadow among shadows as she crept from the room and into the labyrinthine hallways of the sleeping house. Every creak of the old structure, every sigh of the settling foundation, sounded like a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting out her trespass. She paused at every corner, listening, her breath held tight in her chest, expecting at any moment to see the stern figure of Mrs. Higgins or, worse, Adrian himself, emerging from the darkness. Finally, she reached the heavy oak door of the study. The brass handle was cold under her trembling fingers. It was locked, as she knew it would be. Been clear from a different life. A rebellious phase in her late teens, a fascination with locks and the intricate puzzles they presented. It was a hobby her father had swiftly discouraged, deeming it unseemly for an heiress. Now that forgotten skill felt like a lifeline. From the small sewing kit she had brought, she retrieved 2 sturdy hairpins, their metal cool and familiar in her hands. Kneeling before the lock, she shut out the fear, the cold, the pounding of her heart. Her world narrowed to the faint feedback through the metal, the subtle clicks and resistances. Time stretched and distorted. Then, with a final, satisfyingly soft snick, the mechanism yielded. She pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, closing it silently behind her. The study was bathed in moonlight, the furniture casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to lean in, watching her. The air still held his scent, cologne, and ambition. Ignoring the frantic urge to flee, she went straight to the massive mahogany desk, the focal point of his power. Her fingers, still sore from days of labor, traced the carved edges and seams of the desk. She searched for any inconsistency, any hint of a hidden compartment. Nothing. Despair began to curl its cold fingers around her throat. It felt ever so slightly different, a hair's breadth shallower than the rest. There was no visible seam, no keyhole. Remembering a trick from her misspent youth, she pressed hard on one end of the molding while applying upward pressure to the other. Then, with a quiet, almost inaudible click, a small, perfectly disguised section of the wood popped forward, revealing a shallow, hidden drawer nestled within the desk's thick leg. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. The lock had been the first door. This hidden catch was the second. The hidden drawer slid open without a sound, a dark mouth in the moon-washed gloom of the study. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic rhythm that seemed to echo in the profound silence. She leaned forward, her breath held, the scent of old wood and dust filling her nostrils. Inside the shallow space, two distinct stacks lay waiting, neat and purposeful, as if their owner had no fear of them ever being discovered. The first was a sheaf of financial documents, their crisp official paper stark against the dark wood of the drawer. Her eyes, accustomed to reading balance sheets and quarterly reports from her seat on the family's board, scanned the top page with a practiced, dawning horror. The letterhead was from Vance Industries' internal accounting department. They spoke of massive, unsustainable debts, of assets leveraged to their breaking point, of cash flow charts that plummeted into terrifying red. This was not the portrait of a thriving, stable company he presented to the world and to her family. This was a ship taking on water, desperate for a port or a lifeboat. Loan agreements with staggeringly high interest rates from lenders known for their ruthlessness. Notices of overdue payments to key suppliers. It was a house of cards, and the slightest breeze would bring it all crashing down. Her fortune. That was the breeze he was counting on. Her trust fund, vast and largely untouched, was the only capital substantial enough to shore up this sinking enterprise. The pretense of love, the upcoming wedding, it was all a financial strategy, a cold, calculated merger designed to save his crumbling empire. Beneath the financial ruin lay a smaller, more personal artifact, a journal. Her fingers traced the cover, a final barrier between her and the unvarnished truth of the man she had promised to marry. The financial documents laid bare the why of his deception, the desperate, avaricious motive. But this book, she sensed with a cold certainty, would reveal the how. A wave of nausea washed over her, so potent she had to brace a hand against the cool wood of the desk. The opulent room, a testament to the wealth and power he so desperately coveted, seemed to spin around her. The man she had loved was a phantom, a charming fiction constructed to hide a desperate, duplicitous core. The financial documents were not just papers. They were a confession, written in the cold, hard language of bankruptcy and greed. Her heart didn't just pound, it ached, a raw, wounded thing bleeding out in the silent, moonlit study. The test was over. She had found her answer, and it was more devastating than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. The small brass lock on the journal gleamed faintly in the sliver of moonlight, a final, defiant sentinel guarding its master's secrets. Ilara's fingers, still trembling from the shock of the financial documents, now moved with a new purpose, a cold, focused determination that pushed the ache in her heart into a numb corner of her mind. The two hairpins were still clutched in her palm, their metal warmed by her skin. This lock was smaller, more delicate than the one on the study door, an intricate puzzle of finer mechanisms. She bent over the journal, her world narrowing once more to the subtle language of metal and tension. The pins felt clumsy in her sore, raw fingers, but her mind was sharp, her movements precise. Each tiny click of a tumbler was a step closer to the truth, each slight resistance a question to be answered. The silence of the room was absolute, broken only by the soft, almost imperceptible scrape of metal on metal and the frantic rhythm of her own breathing. She could smell the faint, familiar scent of Adrian's cologne on the leather cover, a cruel mockery of the intimacy she had once felt. Then, with a final, minuscule adjustment, the lock yielded with a soft, satisfying pop. The sound was deafening in the quiet study. For a heartbeat, she simply stared at the now unfastened clasp, a part of her terrified of what lay within. The financial ruin had been an abstract horror. This would be personal. Steeling herself, she took a slow, steadying breath and opened the cover. The pages were filled with Adrian's precise, elegant script, so different from the cold man who had snapped his fingers at her. But the words themselves were not elegant. They were cryptic, clinical, and utterly damning. Her eyes scanned the entries, her heart sinking with each phrase she deciphered. Met with D again. The terms are set. The merger must be secured by the 28th. No delays can be tolerated. The 28th. Their wedding date. The prenup is the key. Once signed, her fortune is the engine. All debts cleared, all obstacles removed. She will never have to know a thing. A simple, clean transaction. Her vision blurred for a moment, the words simple, clean transaction swimming on the page. He was reducing her life, her love, her entire being, to a business deal. The client is impatient but understands the necessity of the timeline. The wedding is the trigger. Everything is contingent on that day. Her fortune is the final piece. Entry after entry, it was all there. The deal, the merger he needed to secure. It was her wealth, her future. The wedding was not a celebration. It was a closing date. The cryptic references to her fortune as the key were not romantic metaphors. They were the cold, hard objective of his entire courtship. The journal was a ledger of betrayal, each entry a calculated step in his plan to use her as his financial salvation. The love had never existed. It had all been a transaction, and she was the commodity he had been procuring. The locked drawer had not just held his secrets. It had held the autopsy of their relationship, and it confirmed every terrible fear that had festered in her heart since she first put on the Maid dress. The morning sun did little to warm the chill that had taken permanent residence in Alara bones. The journal's revelations had carved a hollow space inside her, filled with nothing but the cold, hard certainty of Adrian's betrayal. She moved through her duties with a mechanical numbness, her body performing the familiar motions of scrubbing and polishing while her mind replayed the damning phrases from the locked journal. Her fortune is the engine. A simple, clean transaction. It was Mrs. Higgins's sharp, commanding voice that finally pierced her stupor. The head housekeeper stood before her, holding a flat, rectangular package wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with string. Her flinty eyes bore into Alara with their usual impatience. Ellie, stop your dawdling. You are to take this package immediately to the offices of Sterling Holdings in the Meridian Tower downtown. You will deliver it directly to a Mr. Evans at the front reception. You will not linger. You will not dally. You will return promptly. Is that understood? Alara nodded mutely, taking the package. The weight of it felt insignificant compared to the burden she now carried. The errand was a welcome distraction, a chance to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion if only for an hour. The name of the company, Sterling Holdings, meant nothing to her, just another faceless entity in the city's financial district. The journey downtown was a blur of crowded sidewalks and blaring traffic. The Meridian Tower was a sleek obelisk of glass and steel, a monument to modern ambition that reflected the cold, cloudless sky. Pushing through the heavy revolving doors, she entered a cavernous, marble-lined lobby buzzing with the purposeful energy of commerce. The air smelled of expensive perfume and floor polish. She approached the vast, polished reception desk, the package held tightly in her hands. The receptionist, an impeccably coiffed woman with a frosty smile, was speaking into her headset. As Alara waited, her gaze drifted absently toward the bank of elevators across the lobby. The polished brass doors of one elevator slid open with a soft chime, and time stopped. Stepping out into the bright lobby was Adrian. He was dressed not in his usual casual elegance, but in a razor-sharp dark business suit. every inch the powerful CEO. But it was not his attire that froze the blood in Alara's veins. It was the woman on his arm. She was stunning with a severe razor-sharp beauty, her dark hair pulled into a sleek chignon. She wore a tailored charcoal gray dress that screamed of expensive authority, and Adrian's arm was wrapped possessively around her waist, his hand resting on the curve of her hip. His body angled toward hers in an intimate, familiar way. He leaned down, saying something close to her ear that made a cool, professional smile touch her crimson lips. They looked like a perfect, powerful unit, a partnership forged in boardrooms and sealed in secret. The world narrowed to that single, devastating image. The cryptic journal entries, the gossip about the client, the expensive pendant for Isadora, it all coalesced into this one moment of brutal, visual proof. This was the rival lawyer. This was the woman for whom he had bought the diamond pendant. This was his real partner. The package in Alara's hands felt like a lead weight. The receptionist's voice asking for her name and business was a distant buzz, drowned out by the roaring in her ears. She watched, paralyzed, as Adrian and the woman walked across the gleaming floor, their steps in sync, their heads close together, disappearing through a set of glass doors without a single backward glance. They never saw the maid standing frozen at the reception desk, her world shattering silently into a million pieces on the cold, hard marble. The image of Adrian E.'s hand on the woman E.'s waist was seared onto the back of Alara E.'s eyelids, a grotesque afterimage that blotted out the world. The return journey to the mansion was a blur of jarring subway cars and indifferent crowds, her body moving on autopilot while her mind screamed. The plain brown package now delivered felt like it had left a permanent stain on her hands. Each step toward the imposing iron gates was a step deeper into a nightmare of her own making. The elegant stone facade of her home now looking like a gilded prison, she entered through the servant's entrance, the familiar sense of lye soap and starch doing nothing to ground her. The cold, clinical anger that had sustained her through the discovery of the journal was gone, evaporated by the visceral shock of what she had witnessed. In its place was a raw, trembling fury, a live wire sparking dangerously within the confines of her maid's disguise. The careful composure she had maintained for days, the patient observation, the collected gathering of evidence. It all felt like a pathetic game in the face of his brazen public intimacy with another woman. She found him in the sunlit conservatory, lounging in a wicker chair with a newspaper, the very picture of casual domesticity. The afternoon light caught the perfect cut of his hair, the expensive weave of his sweater. He looked up as she entered, his expression immediately shifting to one of bored annoyance at the interruption. His lips parted, no doubt to issue some dismissive order, to snap his fingers and send the clumsy maid away. But the words never came. The sight of him, so at ease, so utterly unrepentant, was the final spark. The dam holding back her rage shattered. She took a step forward, her movement unsteady, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at her sides. The pretense, the alias, the entire carefully constructed charade felt like a suffocating skin she had to shed. You. The word was a ragged breath, torn from a place of such profound hurt it barely sounded like her voice. It was laced with a rawness, a familiarity that was entirely wrong for a servant addressing her master. Adrian's eyebrows lifted in surprise, then narrowed in confusion. He lowered his newspaper slowly, his gaze sharpening, studying her with a new, unsettling intensity. He saw the tremor in her hands, the wild, unguarded pain in her eyes, a look he had never seen on the face of the meek, downtrodden Ellie. For a terrifying, reckless second, the truth hovered on her lips. The words, "I saw you," burned in her throat. I know everything. The mask was slipping, her identity a breath away from revelation, not in a planned, controlled unmasking, but in a torrent of heartbroken fury. She was no longer a spy gathering intelligence. She was a woman confronting the man who had eviscerated her world, and the maid's uniform she wore felt like the cruelest joke of all. The flicker of confusion in Adrian's eyes was snuffed out in an instant, replaced by a cold, hard fury. The raw emotion in her voice, the startling familiarity of her tone, It didn't spark recognition. It ignited his indignation. He rose from his chair in one fluid, menacing motion, the newspaper crumpling forgotten in his hand. The casual domesticity of the scene evaporated, replaced by a charged and dangerous stillness. He took a step toward her, his heightened presence suddenly overwhelming in the sun-dappled room. The air grew cold. The charming suitor, the concerned fiancé, the impatient master, all those masks were gone. What remained was something primal and cruel, a man whose carefully ordered world had been challenged by the one person in it who had no right to do so. "How dare you?" he said, his voice a low, venomous whisper that was far more terrifying than any shout. It was the sound of absolute authority being questioned, and the absolute intention to reassert it. "How dare you address me in such a manner? Who do you think you are?" He didn't wait for an answer, his gaze sweeping over her with utter contempt from her poorly tied cap to her worn, practical shoes. He saw only the uniform, only the servant. Her moment of near confession was not a puzzle to be solved. It was an insolence to be crushed. "I will not tolerate such behavior under my roof," he continued, each word a precisely aimed icicle. "You forget your place. You are a maid. You are here to clean, to be silent, and to be invisible. Your opinions, your tone, your very existence in my line of sight is a privilege I grant you. And it is a privilege I am swiftly revoking." He took another step closer, and she could see the truth then, laid bare in the pitiless cold of his eyes. There was no love there. There was no kindness, no capacity for the tenderness he had so easily feigned over the phone. There was only possession, entitlement, and a raging anger that his property had dared to speak back. The man who had planned to marry her, to share her life and her bed, looked at her now as if she were a stain on his expensive Persian rug. "Consider this your final warning," he hissed, the words lashing against her. "One more misstep, one more look out of turn, and you will be out on the street without a reference. You will be nothing. Do you understand me? Nothing." The cruelty in his eyes was not a momentary flare of temper. It was the bedrock of his character, finally exposed. It confirmed her worst, most devastating fear with a clarity that was more final than any document or journal entry. He didn't love her. He didn't even see her. He loved what she represented: the money, the stability, the solution. And to him, the woman wearing the maid's dress was not the woman he coveted. She was an obstacle, an irritation, a piece of disposable help. The confrontation was over. He had not seen through her disguise. He had simply shown her the monstrous truth of what lay beneath his own. The cold fury that Adrian's cruelty had ignited was a far more potent fuel than despair. It burned away the last vestiges of heartbreak, leaving behind a core of hardened, crystalline resolve. The meek maid, Ellie, was a shell. Within it, Ilara Whitlock, heiress and betrayed woman, began to move with a purpose that her life of luxury had never demanded. His threat to make her nothing echoed in her mind, a challenge she would answer not as a servant, but as the master of the house he sought to plunder. The first opportunity came that evening. Under the pretense of a headache, she secured a rare few hours of reprieve from her duties. Locked in the sparse solitude of her tiny room, she did not rest. From a hidden compartment in her simple suitcase, she retrieved a sleek, encrypted satellite phone, a concession to her family's security team that she had always considered paranoid overkill. Now, it was her most vital tool. Her fingers, no longer clumsy or pained, flew across the keypad with practiced ease. She bypassed the mansion's monitored networks, accessing a private, secure server that linked directly to the formidable intelligence arm of her family's corporate empire. The resources that had always been at her fingertips, which she had never before thought to use for personal reasons, were now weaponized. The query was simple, the parameters narrow. Identify the woman seen with Adrian Vance at the Meridian Tower that day. She described the severe beauty, the professional attire, the air of sharp authority, feeding the details into the vast, silent digital web. The system, impersonal and efficient, began its work, cross-referencing facial recognition databases, corporate registries, and personnel files with a speed no private investigator could match. Within minutes, a dossier began to populate the screen, a chillingly complete profile materializing from the digital ether. The woman was Isadora Volkov, a name that struck a familiar and ominous chord. A partner at Volkov and Associates, a law firm notorious for its ruthless win-at-all-costs litigation, and its primary client, Darrington Global. The rival company's name was a splash of acid on the page. The pieces, once scattered and cryptic, slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. Isadora. Not a ghost, but a predator. The expensive pendant was not a romantic token. It was a retainer, a gilded handshake sealing a pact. Ilara's eyes scanned the details of Volkov's specialty: corporate takeovers and hostile mergers. The journal's cryptic entries, the deal, the merger secured by the wedding date, were no longer abstract. They were a battle plan. The merger Adrian was so desperate to secure was not a blending of companies in partnership. It was a takeover, an annihilation. He wasn't just planning to use her fortune to save his failing company. He was planning to hand the revitalized entity, now fattened with her wealth, over to Darrington Global in exchange for his own salvation, a king selling his kingdom to save his own crown. Her fortune was the bait, the wedding the trap, and Isadora Volkov was the architect. The other woman was far more than a mistress. She was the enemy's chief strategist, and Adrian was her willing pawn. The personal betrayal was now inextricably woven with a corporate one, each making the other more vile, more complete. The game had escalated from a test of love to a war for her very legacy. The encrypted phone felt cold and heavy in Ilara's hand, a stark conduit to a reality more brutal than any fiction. The dossier on Isadora Volkov glowed on the screen, each line of text a hammer blow chiseling away the last remnants of her former life. The woman was not a mere affair. She was the sharp legal spearhead of a hostile takeover, and Adrian was guiding it directly toward Ilara's heart. The personal and the corporate had fused into a single monstrous betrayal. The evidence in the journal and the hidden drawer was compelling, but it was circumstantial, a trail of breadcrumbs. She needed the feast itself. She needed irrefutable digital proof. Her opportunity came under the guise of a final late-night cleaning of the main floor studies, a task Mrs. Higgins assigned with a grim satisfaction, a punishment for the perceived insolence Adrian had reported. The mansion was once again submerged in that profound, waiting silence, the kind that seemed to absorb sound and intention. But Ilara was no longer a nervous shadow. She was a hunter, and the silence was her ally. She entered his study not with trepidation, but with a cold, focused resolve. The room held no power over her anymore. It was merely the scene of the crime. She went straight to the mahogany desk, her movements efficient and sure. His computer, a sleek black monolith, was the final vault. She pressed the power button, the soft whir of its awakening the only sound in the room. A password prompt glowed on the screen, a lesser obstacle. Adrian was arrogant, believing his physical locks were security enough. He used the same combination of numbers and letters for everything: the date of his company, S founding, and his mother S name. Her fingers flew over the keys, inputting the morbid tribute to the woman whose name he used as a shield for his treachery. The system accepted it without protest, unlocking his digital world. Files and folders blossomed on the screen, a chaotic garden of corporate reports and personal correspondence. She navigated through them with a ruthless precision, her eyes scanning for keywords: prenup, agreement, trust fund, merger. And then she found it. A folder, innocuously labeled wedding logistics. Inside, amongst files for florists and caterers, was a document named FA Final. Her hand hesitated for only a second over the mouse. Then she double-clicked. The document that opened was not a celebration of union. It was a contract of surrender. The header made her blood run cold. Prenuptial agreement. Whitlock, Vance. She began to read, the legalese painting a picture so cold, so calculated, it made the journal entries seem almost sentimental. The terms were devastating. In the event of a divorce, which the language heavily implied he anticipated, she would walk away with nothing. Not a penny of her own trust fund, which was to be immediately transferred to a jointly managed account upon marriage, an account the document granted him sole signing authority over. But it was the final clause, buried in subsection after subsection, that was the masterstroke of his deception. It granted him power of attorney over her assets in the case of any perceived financial instability or crisis affecting Vance Industries. Her eyes scanned the vague, terrifyingly broad language. It was a clause designed to be triggered, a self-destruct button for her financial independence built directly into their marriage contract. Her entire fortune, the legacy of generations, would be legally handed to him to pour into the bottomless pit of his failing company, a company he was then contractually bound to merge with Darrington Global. This was the proof, not a whispered secret or a cryptic journal entry, but a cold, drafted legal document. It laid bare the entire sordid plot, the love, the wedding, the future. All of it was a legal maneuver, a hostile acquisition of a person. She sat back in his leather chair, the glow of the screen illuminating her pale, stunned face. The pieces were no longer fragments. They were a completed, horrifying picture. She had the proof. And with it, she held the power to break the deal wide open. The seventh day dawned with a brittle, formal energy that crackled through the mansion's usually serene halls. Adrian had ordered a lavish, intimate dinner to be prepared, a performance of concerned devotion he intended to broadcast. The grand dining room with its mile-long table and cascading crystal chandeliers was set for one. At the head of the table, a tablet was propped up, its screen dark but waiting, a portal through which the ailing Alara would be summoned to witness his charade of missing her. The air was thick with the cloying scent of hothouse flowers and roasted game, a feast for an audience of ghosts. From her vantage point in the servants' wing, Alara watched the final preparations with a heart that had turned to stone. The proof, the damning prenuptial agreement, was a hard, flat rectangle tucked into the waistband of her maid's skirt, its edges digging into her skin with every movement. A constant, painful reminder. She had spent the day in a state of eerie calm, performing her duties with an automaton's precision, her mind a vault containing the single devastating truth. The time for watching, for gathering, for hiding, was over. As the first course was served to Adrian's solitary place setting by a silent, nervous footman, Alara slipped away from the bustle of the kitchen. She did not go to her room. Instead, she walked toward the grand staircase, her worn shoes silent on the polished marble. The sounds of the dinner, the soft clink of silverware, the low murmur of Adrian's voice as he tested the video connection, grew louder with each step. She paused at the threshold of the dining room, hidden in the shadow of the arched doorway. Adrian was adjusting his tie on the tablet screen, practicing a look of tender concern. He was the picture of a grieving lover, preparing to dine alone while his beloved convalesced far away. The hypocrisy of the scene was so absolute it felt like a physical force. Taking a deep, steadying breath that did nothing to calm the furious tremor in her hands, she stepped out of the shadows and into the pool of golden light cast by the chandelier. The stiff, rough fabric of her maid's uniform felt like a costume she was finally shedding. Her footsteps, usually meant to be silent and self-effacing, now echoed on the parquet floor with a deliberate, Zhuangao-xingde weight. Adrian, his attention fixed on his own reflection, did not notice her at first. It was the sudden sharp gasp from the footman standing rigidly against the wall that made him look up, his practiced expression of concern shifting instantly to one of bewildered irritation. His eyes landed on her, and the irritation curdled into cold anger. "You," he spat, his voice a low, dangerous thing in the opulent room. "What is the meaning of this? Get out, now." But Alara did not stop. The face of her family's lawyer, Mr. Sterling, appeared, his expression one of polite expectation, ready for the scheduled check-in on the absent heiress. She stopped a few feet from Adrian, the prenuptial agreement cold in her hand. The screen on the tablet, now live and broadcasting, showed the stunning, impossible contrast. The wealthy fiancé at his lavish solitary dinner, and the maid he had threatened and dismissed, standing before him not with downcast eyes but with a look of glacial fury, holding the document that detailed his ruin. The unmasking had not begun with words, but with her silent, defiant presence, a living, breathing accusation that shattered his carefully staged reality. The video call was a live wire, humming with silent, unseen witnesses. On the tablet's screen, the politely expectant face of Mr. Sterling, her family's lawyer, sharpened into stunned confusion. Other faces flickered into view in the background of his study, her uncle's stern profile, a flash of her cousin's wide-eyed shock. They were all watching, their planned reassurance call hijacked by the surreal unfolding drama in her own dining room. Adrian's face was a mask of thunderous fury, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the table. "I said get out," he repeated. The command. Ilara ignored him. Her attention was fixed on the screen, on the faces of her family. Her voice, when it finally came, did not tremble with weakness but with a fury so cold it turned the air in the room to ice. It was not the voice of Ellie the maid. It was the voice of Ilara Whitlock, heiress betrayed. "Well, here I am." Adrian made a sudden, aborted move to disconnect the call, but he was frozen, trapped by the sheer audacity of the moment. With a deliberate slow motion, she reached into the waistband of her skirt and pulled out the folded document. She held it up, turning it so the stark, official header was visible to the camera. Prenuptial agreement. Whitlock Vance. "This," she said, her voice gaining strength, laced with a heartbreak that had calcified into pure, unadulterated rage, "is what my devoted fiancé has been planning. Not a life with me. A transaction. This document grants him control of my entire trust fund the moment we are married, and a legal right to seize it all to save his failing company, which he intends to merge with Darrington Global the second my money is his." She let the words hang in the air, let the horrific implications sink in for the audience on the screen. She saw her uncle's face darken, his business mind already connecting the treacherous dots. "For the past week," she continued, her gaze sweeping back to Adrian, who stood paralyzed, his facade crumbling into ash, "I have not been away. I have been here, in this house, working as his maid. I have listened to him mock me, threaten me, dismiss me. I have found the receipts for jewelry bought for his real partner, Isadora Volkov, the lawyer spearheading Darrington's takeover bid. I have read his private journal detailing this merger that must be secured by our wedding day. And I have seen him with her." She took a step closer to the table, to him, to the camera, her every word a nail in the coffin of his ambitions. The love was a lie. She finally turned her full attention to Adrian, whose face was a grotesque palette of rage, shock, and dawning horror. The charming suitor was utterly gone, stripped away to reveal the desperate, avaricious core. "You wanted my fortune, Adrian," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You should have been honest. But you wanted my love too. And that, you will never have." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint, tinny sound of her uncle's voice beginning to issue sharp, urgent commands from the tablet's speaker. The unmasking was complete. The performance was over. The truth, ugly and brutal, was now broadcasting live to the entire world that mattered, and there was no taking it back. The silence that followed Ilara's declaration was more profound than any sound, a vacuum that sucked the air from the room. On the tablet screen, the stunned faces of her family were already shifting into masks of cold, corporate fury, their voices a distant, buzzing hum of urgent questions and commands. But in the dining room, all that existed was the space between Ilara and the ruin of the man before her. Adrian's paralysis shattered. The horror and shock that had gripped him melted away, not into apology or remorse, but into something uglier, more fundamental. The charming facade, already cracked beyond repair, now fell away completely, revealing the raw, entitled core beneath. He didn't look at the tablet, at the witnesses to his downfall. His eyes, burning with a venomous, defensive rage, were locked solely on Ilara. A harsh, mirthless laugh escaped him, a dry, brittle sound that grated against the opulent silence. "You," he spat, the word dripping with contempt, he took a step toward her, his earlier fear replaced by a towering, indignant arrogance. "You self-righteous little fool. You think this is a revelation? You think you've uncovered some great secret?" He swept a hand around the room, a gesture that encompassed the crystal, the silver, the obscene wealth that surrounded them. "Look at it, all of it. You were born into a fortress of money and you have the audacity to test people, to play your little games. You dangled your fortune like a golden carrot and then pretended to be shocked when donkeys followed. You created this." His voice was cold, analytical, utterly devoid of the warmth that had once charmed her. It was the voice of a man presenting a closing argument, justifying a crime by blaming the victim. "You set a trap with your wealth and then condemned me for walking into it. That prenup?" He jabbed a finger at the document still clutched in her hand. "That was business. That was survival. My company was bleeding, and your trust fund was a tourniquet, a simple, logical transaction. But you had to dress it up in pretty lies about love. You wanted the fantasy, so I gave it to you. I gave you the fairy tale. And you call me the deceiver?" He took another step, his eyes glinting with a cruel, mocking light. "This pathetic game of yours, playing dress-up in your own house? Was that meant to prove something? That people treat a maid differently than an heiress? What a stunning discovery. You proved the world has a hierarchy. Congratulations." He shook his head, a smirk twisting his lips. "You didn't uncover a monster, Elara. You just finally looked in the mirror. Your money is a magnet for greed. It's all you are, and you tempted me with it. So don't stand there and judge me for accepting the invitation you broadcast to the world every single day." There was no apology, no shred of guilt, only a cold, brutal justification that twisted the entire narrative to cast him as the logical actor and her as the naive architect of her own betrayal. The man she had loved had not just vanished, he had never existed. In his place stood a stranger who saw human connection as a transaction and love as a currency he was entitled to manipulate. Before he could spew more venom, the heavy dining room doors swung open. Two members of the mansion's security team, their faces grim and professional, entered the room. They had evidently been summoned by the frantic commands emanating from the tablet. Their eyes took in the scene. The heiress in a maid's uniform, the furious fiancé, the live video call, without a flicker of surprise. "Mr. Vance," the lead guard said, his tone firm and impersonal. "You need to come with us." Adrian's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of outraged disbelief. "You work for me," he snarled. "We work for the Whitlock estate, sir," the guard corrected calmly. He nodded toward the tablet where Elara's uncle could be seen giving a sharp, silent nod of confirmation. "Your presence is no longer required here." For a moment it looked as if Adrian might resist, might unleash his fury on the guards. But the reality of his situation finally seemed to crash down upon him. The game was over. He had lost. With one last, searing look of pure hatred directed at Elara, he allowed himself to be guided from the room, his shoulders stiff with impotent rage. The grand doors closed behind him, shutting out the sound of his footsteps, leaving Elara alone in the devastating quiet of the aftermath, the ghost of his cruel justification hanging in the air like a poison. The heavy thud of the mansion's main doors closing echoed through the cavernous grand hall like the final note of a funeral dirge. The air, once charged with the electric current of confrontation and fury, now hung still and heavy, thick with the dust of shattered illusions. Elara stood motionless in the center of the vast room, the ornate parquet floor stretching away from her in every direction, like a frozen sea. The silence was a physical presence, pressing in on her ears, a stark contrast to the roaring tempest that had just subsided. With a slow, weary wave of her hand, she dismissed the handful of stunned staff who lingered in the doorways, their faces pale masks of confusion and fear. They retreated without a word, their footsteps hushed and hurried, eager to escape the unsettling aftermath. The great doors whispered shut once more, sealing her in a tomb of her own making. Alone. The word echoed in the hollowed-out space within her chest. She was utterly, completely alone in the grand hall that had witnessed her debut, her engagement party, and now, the spectacular implosion of her future. The opulence that surrounded her was no longer beautiful. It was accusatory. The gilded moldings, the towering portraits of stern ancestors, the cascading crystal of the chandelier, each gleam and glint felt like a mockery, a testament to the fortune that had almost been her undoing. This was the treasure he had sought to plunder, the gilded cage she had been born into, and the very thing that had blinded her to the wolf in sheep's clothing. She walked slowly to a velvet-upholstered bench, her legs feeling boneless and weak. The rough fabric of her maid's uniform scratched against her skin, a coarse and constant reminder of the week that had stripped her bare. She sank onto it, the weight of her body feeling insignificant compared to the leaden weight in her soul. The evidence of Adrian's plot, the prenup, the journal, the receipt, lay scattered on the floor where they had fallen, pitiful paper monuments to his greed. A profound emptiness opened up inside her, a vast echoing chasm where her love, her trust, and her future had once resided. The fury that had sustained her, that had given her the strength to unmask him, had burned out, leaving behind only cold, gray ash. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean. The grand hall, with its soaring ceiling and immense wealth, seemed to shrink her, to emphasize the sheer nothingness she now felt. She had won. She had exposed the plot and saved her legacy. Yet, sitting amidst the spoils of her victory, she had never felt more impoverished. The pieces of her broken world lay all around her, and she had no idea how or if they could ever be fit back together. A week was a lifetime measured in the quiet, methodical work of dismantling a future. The grand hall no longer felt like a tomb, but a command center stripped of sentiment. The scattered evidence of Adrian's betrayal had been gathered, not as relics of heartbreak, but as exhibits for the legal and corporate war that was already underway. The hollow ache inside Alara had not vanished, but it had been filled with a new substance, a cold, tempered steel of resolve. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling window of her corporate office, high above the city her family had helped build. The skyline was a testament to ambition and power, a language she now understood she must speak fluently. Below, the city teemed with life, oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred in the penthouse of the Whitlock Tower. She was no longer dressed in the rough wool of a maid or the delicate silks of a society heiress. She wore a tailored suit of deepest charcoal, its severe lines and impeccable cut armor of her own choosing. Her hair was swept back from a face that was pale but composed, the last traces of grief banked behind eyes that now saw the world with a ruthless, unflinching clarity. The ornate mirror in her hallway had shown her a stranger this morning, a woman forged in the fire of betrayal, her softness hardened into sharp angles, her naivety replaced by a watchful stillness. The girl who had believed in fairy tales had died in that sunlit conservatory, dismissed as nothing. The woman who had risen in her place would be everything. The door to her office opened, and her assistant gave a quiet nod. The board was assembled, taking a final, steadying breath that was not about calming nerves but about drawing purpose into her lungs. She turned from the window. The city at her back was no longer just a view. It was her domain. She walked into the boardroom, her heels striking the polished granite floor with a sound that was both announcement and assertion. The long mahogany table was surrounded by a dozen of the most powerful figures in the corporate empire. Older men, her father's contemporaries, their expressions a mixture of professional concern, paternalistic doubt, and in some cases, thinly veiled ambition. They saw the young heiress, the girl who had nearly been their ruin. She did not take her customary seat. She remained standing at the head of the table, placing her palms flat on the cool, smooth surface. The room fell silent, all eyes upon her. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice not the trembling, heartbroken thing from the dining room, but a clear, calm instrument that carried to every corner of the room. "The engagement to Adrian Vance is terminated. All ties, personal and preliminary business, are severed. Our legal team is already moving to freeze his assets and pursue litigation for fraud and attempted corporate espionage." She paused, letting the absolute finality of the statement settle over them. There were sharp intakes of breath, exchanged glances. One of the older members opened his mouth to speak, a question about caution, About reputation, doubtless on his lips. She cut him off with a look, her gaze sweeping across each of them, leaving no doubt about who held the floor. This is not a discussion, it is a statement of fact. The due diligence into Vance Industries has revealed a catastrophic failure of judgment on our part. A blindness I take full responsibility for. That blindness ends now. She pushed a file across the table. It contained not the emotional evidence of his betrayal, but a cold analytical report on the vulnerabilities his plot had exposed in their own corporate structure. Our immediate focus will be internal consolidation. We will review all standing contracts, reassess all joint ventures, and implement new, stringent protocols for financial and personal security. The Whitlock name will no longer be synonymous with trust. It will be synonymous with strength, with shrewdness, with an impenetrable will. She saw the shift in their faces then. The paternalistic doubt began to evaporate, replaced by a dawning recognition. They were not looking at a heartbroken girl. They were looking at a CEO. She was no longer a placeholder for her future husband's ambition. She was the architect of her own destiny. I will be assuming direct, executive control of all merger and acquisition strategies, she stated, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. This company was built on vision and fortitude. It will not be weakened by deception or nearly lost to a pretty face and a hollow promise. We will rebuild, not on the terms of others, but on our own. Are there any questions? The silence that followed was different from the one in the grand hall. It was not empty. It was full of a new, formidable respect. The questions, when they came, were about logistics, about timelines, about strategy. They were the questions of subordinates to their commander. Ilara answered each one with a precision and foresight that silenced any remaining doubt. The meeting adjourned not with pats on the back or words of consolation, but with brisk nods and a renewed sense of purpose. As the room emptied, she remained standing at the head of the table, the city sprawling before her through the wall of glass. The pieces had not been put back together as they were. They had been melted down and recast into something stronger, sharper, and entirely her own. The new beginning was not a return to innocence. It was a coronation of hard-won wisdom. She was Ilara Whitlock, and she was ready.